Before the February 24th invasion, most public discourse both in the West and in Russia assumed that Russia, with the largest non-American air force in the world, would quickly be able to establish air superiority over the skies in Ukraine. Air superiority would then set the conditions for Russia to use its impressive array of attack and transport helicopters to better support its ground offensive. And indeed, by the 6th of March, Major General Konashenkov, the Russian spokesman, was fronting the media explaining that basically all combat-ready aviation in Ukraine had been destroyed. Reporting carried in TASS confirmed that Ukraine's air defences were being degraded by precision weapons, and the implication was that air superiority had either already been achieved or was at most days away. In reality, of course, more than 7 months after the war began, shootdowns of both Russian and Ukrainian aircraft continue. Claimed Russian losses were particularly high during the height of the Kharkiv counteroffensive, while Ukrainian losses also continue to mount. For both sides, the skies over Ukraine are singularly dangerous, and many of the videos we see of both helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft involve them flying at dangerously low altitude. These aircraft can be seen skimming the deck, reducing their range and fuel efficiency and opening them up to attack by things like man-pads and even simple anti-aircraft guns. These aren't the kind of manoeuvres that pilots would pull for fun. They're dangerous and impose a special sort of strain on both airframe and pilot. But in Ukraine, it seems these sort of mission profiles at low level are the only option. The skies higher up are simply too dangerous. Both Ukraine and Russia inherited the old Soviet focus on air defense systems. Collectively, they operate thousands of surface-to-air missile systems that have made the skies above Ukraine arguably the most dangerous in the world. And with systems like S-300 and S-400 in play, both air forces have instead decided to operate at either very, very long standoff range or close to the deck. For Western observers trained on conflicts where the very first step before any offensive is the acquisition of air superiority, it's an entirely different world. And I thought it would be worth looking at the systems and tactics that have made this situation possible. Because as much as people like to criticize Russian tanks or other equipment, it's clear that in Ukraine at least the air defense systems have been doing their job. So in terms of what I'm going to be talking about, first I'm going to give a little bit of a history of Soviet-Russian air defense development and look at some of the primary systems that are in operation in Ukraine. Then I'm going to look at how those systems have been used over different phases of the war. I'm going to consider issues of losses and resupply, so some of the statistics we have available to us from open source, and also the role of Western systems, what they have available and what's being sent to Ukraine. Then when it comes time to talk about how effective these systems are, I'm actually going to branch the discussion. I'm going to talk about their effectiveness against traditional targets like fighter jets and helicopters first, and then I want to talk about the unconventional targets they've been forced to fight in Ukraine. Things like micro-drones, things like GMLRS rockets from the Himars system that have posed a little bit more challenge for traditional air defense solutions. Having done that, I'm going to draw out some key themes and observations from the conflict so far and ask what this means next for air defense both in Ukraine and also globally. So let's jump right into a history of the development of Soviet and Russian air defenses and some of the systems involved here. Because if you don't understand the systems, it's going to be hard to understand how we got to the place we're at with contested airspace over a country, despite the fact that one country had a very small air force and the other had the largest non-American air force in the world. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union placed intense focus on the development of surface-to-air missiles and air defenses. And the development was driven by a combination of doctrinal and technological factors. And here I want to flag that I am going to be deliberately oversimplifying the situation. Weapon development, purchasing and deployment decisions in the Soviet Union were often the result of an interesting, complex interplay between various members of the political leadership, the military leadership, the thinking of the day, and the economic necessities they faced. We associate things like lobbying and political patronage with Western economies, but they were definitely present in the Soviet Union. But I can't give a full history of those factors, so we're going to focus on the doctrinal and the technical. In terms of doctrine, the Soviet Union understood that in any conflict it would likely be matched up against NATO air forces. And in the early Cold War in particular, the threat of strategic air command to major Soviet cities and centres was very keenly felt and transmitted. The ability to counter NATO air power, and to do so on a budget, was a significant ask, and so surface-to-air missiles were leaned on as one possible solution to the problem, part of a wider air defense system that involved fighter and interceptor aircraft. Combined with this doctrinal requirement were technological and economic pressures. In terms of economics, the Soviets were not alone in concluding that surface-to-air missile systems might be a more economically viable solution to enemy air threats than ever larger fleets of manned interceptors, although they obviously wanted those too. The British 1957 Defence White Paper, remember, basically questioned the entire future for manned aircraft in an environment that it believed would be dominated by surface-to-air missiles. Technological factors probably played a role as well. As the Cold War dragged on, there were elements of the technological race that the Soviet Union did fall behind in, computing and miniaturized avionics being one example. But those limitations matter more when size and weight are serious concerns, the way they are on, for example, an aircraft or an air-to-air missile. They're not as much of a concern when you can have a larger system based on the ground. The weakness of basing a system on the ground, of course, is that you need superior rocket motors in order to lift the heavier resulting missile to its target. And rocketry, of course, was an area of relative advantage for the Soviet Union throughout much of the Cold War. As a result of their focus, plus the threat posed by Western air forces, the Soviets and then the Russians developed a suite of capabilities that are designed to operate as part of one IADS, an integrated air defense system. Whatever the range or whatever the target type, if it's in the air, the Soviets or the Russians probably designed something intent on shooting it down. From systems designed to service targets hundreds of kilometers away, to those designed for missile interception, to relatively simple shoulder-mounted systems, the Soviets and now the Russians basically have it all. And to put a little more context around the rest of this presentation, I thought I'd give a couple of key examples of these systems before we move on. In the long-range category, the Russians have systems like S-300 and S-400. These are relatively complex, high-footprint systems. A battery of S-300s doesn't just include the trucks with the missiles on the back, the TEL, the Transporter Erector Launcher Unit, but also a dizzying array of radars and support vehicles. Now, S-300 as a system dates back to the 1960s, but as with so many weapon systems designed by the Soviets, not all S-300s currently in service were created equal. Both the system, that is, the radars and the launch systems and support vehicles, as well as the missiles themselves, have been upgraded multiple times. For example, the PMU-1 and 2 upgrade packages came in the 1990s. And while with something like a tank, an upgrade package might mean slightly thicker armour or better electronics and better fire control, with air defense systems, a new generation of missiles, for example, or a new radar, can fundamentally alter the performance capabilities of a system. But the basic role of S-300 across most of its iterations remains the same: protect large areas of airspace and engage targets potentially at quite long ranges. In that context, S-400 functions as sort of an S-300 successor. It upgrades many of S-300's performance characteristics and introduces a few new options of its own. At its most extreme, it's claimed that S-400 using the 40N6E missile can engage targets out to 400 kilometers, which is truly quite remarkable when you compare it to most Western systems. Of course, there are a lot of asterisks next to that number. In order to shoot something down at 400 kilometers, you need to be able to see it and lock on it at 400 kilometers. And when you're engaging a target with that sort of missile at the extent of its range, you really hope that the target isn't maneuverable or quick. If it can simply turn around and evade, you're going to run the missile out of fuel. So really, this is the sort of thing you'd be firing against, say, tanker aircraft as opposed to incoming fighters. Against targets like low-flying cruise missiles, expect engagement ranges measured in the tens of kilometers rather than the hundreds. But the range and the capability of these sort of systems is undeniable. They can dominate large areas of airspace, and Ukraine and Russia both operate very large fleets of S-300 launchers, and Russia has S-400s as well. And when I say a lot of them, I mean a lot of them. Military Balance 2021 estimated that Ukraine would have gone into this war with something like 250 S-300 units. Russia, meanwhile, seems confident enough in its stockage levels that it's been using S-300s in a ground attack role, firing expensive anti-aircraft guided missiles against ground targets. At closer ranges, both sides use Buk and Tor type missile systems. Buk entered service in 1980, but it's been modernised and given new missiles over time. Buk is only going to engage targets out to the low tens of kilometers, but it's more mobile, lighter, and in some ways a more capable system. The launch vehicle is tracked, smaller, and lighter, so it can keep up with advancing military units. The command vehicle and the target acquisition radar are likewise often on tracked mounts. Buk is one of the systems we have the most footage of from its use in Ukraine against targets ranging from aircraft to drones, and infamously, it is also the system responsible for the MH17 shootdown. Step down that range later again and you get a system like Tor. This is a system that's designed to engage relatively agile, highly maneuverable targets, potentially even incoming rockets, but it does it at a much shorter range than systems like Buk or S-300. For a casual observer, Tor is hard to identify as an anti-aircraft vehicle because the missile system isn't obvious. The missile launch racks are internal, but make no mistake, this is a capable surface-to-air missile system, even if it just kind of looks like a box on tracks. But such was the fear of NATO air power, and particularly NATO helicopters, that the Soviets and now the Russians didn't place all their trust in Buk or Tor or S-300 to keep that air power off their advancing armoured columns. To that end, they developed a huge range of short-range air defence systems designed to fend them off at the final point of contact. These are vehicles either intended to provide point defence of specific installations or to keep up with the tanks and the armoured vehicles in order to fend off helicopters and other such threats. The most famous system here is probably the Pantsir, famous for its $15 million price tag, the large number of them that were supplied to Syria, the great hype around its entry into service, and the fact that quite a significant number of the things got stuck in the mud during the initial Ukrainian invasion, and some of them ended up torched with Molotov cocktails by angry locals. An incident, I would argue, which probably tells us more about Russian logistics and organisation in the opening days, as opposed to anything basic and fundamental about the performance characteristics of the system. I can't imagine a German Flakpanzer Gepard would do particularly well if someone took it nose first into a muddy ditch and then abandoned it, for example. Systems aren't soldier-proof. But in any case, the Pantsir and the modern systems are vastly outnumbered by older systems in both Russian and Ukrainian service. You have the Tunguska, a combined missile gun system, Osa, which is a missile system, Strela, again, a light mobile missile system. The list goes on. Even nominally retired systems like Shilka, this is a gun-only system with no missile mounts, those have started to reappear in both Russian and Ukrainian service. And if somehow the incoming American helicopter pilot isn't dead after the application of all of these air defense missile systems, well, there's still a proliferation of shoulder-launched man-portable air defense systems and older anti-aircraft guns. Both sides in the Ukraine war have been using the older Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns in pretty large numbers. As far as technology goes, that's pretty much as old as it gets. But in Ukraine, basically anything that can be pushed into service is being pushed into service. And the number of modern drones or aircraft that can shrug off a round from one of these old guns is few and far between. When you take all of this together, Russia before this invasion could offer a huge range of air defense capabilities, long-range systems, short-range systems. It could offer capabilities at a budget and in very large numbers. And as such, it shouldn't be surprising that in the global air defense market, Russia was the dominant actor. Between 2001 and 2021, according to SIPRI figures, Russia controlled about 42% of the air defense system export market, as compared to the 25% controlled by the United States. S-400 would be sold to both Turkey and the People's Republic of China. S-300 would be sold in large numbers to the PRC, Syria, and a number of other powers. More than 200 Pantsir systems would be sold. And remember, that's a system that the Russians nominated about $15 million a pop to Syria, to Iraq, Algeria, the United Arab Emirates, and more besides. And if you were in the market for something just a tad more retro, Tor, Buk, and S-125 Pechora, in its 2M variant, were also major sellers. The core point here is that air defense is something the Soviet Union and Russia do. It is an area of relative competitive advantage where they have invested extensive effort for decades and where they have built up a substantial inventory. And thus, it should be no surprise that when Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, it involved a clash between two nations with significant air defense assets, a fact which greatly shaped how the war would play out. Because while the Ukrainian Air Force was certainly small compared to its Russian opponent, its air defense assets were some of the most impressive in Europe. And if Russia intended to neutralize them, well, it would require a carefully planned first strike, properly executed. That's not what happened. Now, our understanding of even the earliest days of the war are still limited, but here's what I've been able to piece together. Both sides seem to have suffered significant problems with their air defense capabilities early on. For Ukraine, it seems like the air defense was significantly disrupted in the opening hours of the invasion, both by an intensive Russian electronic warfare and jamming effort, and by the fact that many Ukrainian batteries seem to have gotten orders, quite rightly, to disperse from their pre-war positions in order to avoid being hit by missile or airstrikes. As a result of this disruption, gaps would open in the Ukrainian air defense system, allowing Russian airborne forces to make it all the way to the gates of Kyiv, something which would be beyond the pale now in October. But in this initial period, Russian helicopters were able to operate right up against the Ukrainian capital. Ukrainian systems, air defense and otherwise, were heavily disrupted by electronic and cyber attacks. But at the same time, the Russian air defense system was hardly covering itself in glory either, and it didn't exactly have the excuse of having to hide from incoming cruise missile and Iskander attacks. The initial Russian armoured thrust against Kyiv seems to have broken down the Russian organisation and logistics system. Air defence vehicles were often spotted either out of fuel, abandoned, or with their radars turned off, or even just not wired into an integrated system. Also interesting, although still obviously very unconfirmed, are the reports that at some point in the early stages of the Russian invasion, an order was given that was basically the Russian equivalent of cease buzzer, that is, stop jamming. One article, for example, by retired Colonel Jeffrey Fisher of the United States Air Force, a former electronic warfare officer, observed that this behaviour was likely as a result of fears over fratricidal jamming. That is, that the Russians were jamming their own advanced units, and the call went out to cease their electronic warfare activities. In that bizarre environment, we got to see TB2 drones, slow-moving, relatively unstealthy drones operating directly over some of the most advanced air defense missile systems in the world, taking potshots at them with micro-munitions. Of all the scenes in the early war, the videos of TB2s destroying Buk TELs has to be my most surprising. On paper, those drones should have been easy meat, and yet they were ranging over the lines wreaking havoc. A slow, vulnerable aircraft destroying anti-aircraft systems that were worth far more than it was. So while Russian electronic warfare and jamming definitely won a victory in the opening hours and days of the war, the Russian air defense system, particularly on the northern front, didn't exactly get a passing grade. But on both sides, those sort of issues would prove to be temporary. Ukrainian air defences were able to re-site themselves, integrate, and also begin to evade jamming, because as the Russian forces moved forward, jamming, which is essentially a directional activity, became harder and harder, among other things. Again, that's speculative at this stage, but there are people on the ground who claim that it's true. At the same time, the Russians were able to sort out the original organisational chaos. They were able to get their batteries sorted out, their radars switched on, and eventually establish something like an air defence network over much of the front line. The result was a brief spike in aircraft losses, followed by everyone collectively deciding on both sides that the deck was where they wanted to operate. Mid and high altitude was now a no-go zone for anyone flying a jet or a helicopter. This was now the kind of high-threat environment where only advanced stealthy systems like F-35 were intended to operate, and even then at high risk. And neither Russia nor Ukraine were on Lockheed Martin's authorised buyer list. Instead, aircraft and helicopters would now operate at low altitude, something which actually led to an increase, a sustained increase, in casualties credited to short-range air defence systems, things like manpads. Now, if one looks at the statistics alone without any context, you can look at these and argue that manpads and short-range air defences are the solution to all problems. After all, look at it, they're shooting down jets and helicopters galore. But those jets and helicopters wouldn't even be within range if it wasn't for the S-300s and the Buks, forcing these aircraft and helicopters down to dangerously low altitude. Make no mistake, every fighter pilot I've ever met is a self-confessed adrenaline junkie, but most of them don't want to fly 3 foot off the deck just for fun in a combat zone. They're more inclined towards safer activities like base jumping. They're after the risky, not the suicidal. So forcing them down this low was a credit to the air defense system. It was exactly the kind of interplay between different systems with different engagement altitudes and ranges that the Soviets and the Russians had always expected. The only problem from their perspective is it was cutting both ways. The Ukrainian Air Force was basically reduced to fighting an airborne guerrilla war, but the Russian Air Force had to kind of sneak around as well. Deep penetration operations into Ukraine, like the airborne landing at Hostomel in the opening days, were thoroughly off the menu. But that's not to say that air defense in Ukraine has had it all its own way. There have definitely been some hard targets that both sides have struggled with. Ukraine, for example, has struggled with high-performance cruise missiles, Iskander, and recently Shahed drones and loitering munitions from Iran. Russia, meanwhile, has found it very difficult to intercept things like GMLRS rockets fired from Himars. We'll examine both of these problems later on. But the basic gist is that while existing air defense systems have had a pretty good time of it countering aircraft and helicopters, there are other target types they've struggled with a bit. And there have also been points where the air defense systems on both sides fray a little bit, crack, are momentarily disrupted at certain points in the front. Both sides have sometimes struggled during rapid offensive operations. We've talked about the fact that Russia really struggled during the Kyiv offensive to get its air defense system together, but there were also days during the Kharkiv offensive for Ukraine where air defense wasn't providing the protection it probably should have. That's supported both by anecdotal statements on the ground and also by the fact that there was an increase in Russian sortie rates and then suddenly a spike in Russian air casualties in Kharkiv once the air defense systems begin to catch up. Another example of a temporarily disruptive event was the introduction of American anti-radiation missiles, HARM missiles. These are missiles designed to home in on radar emissions. In other words, an aircraft fires it in the direction of a suspected SAM installation, the missile detects the emissions from an anti-aircraft radar system and goes and introduces itself. In terms of electronic signature, the anti-aircraft radar system on an S-300 is hardly subtle, and once these systems began being introduced, Russian air defense losses, but also Russian air defenses shutting off their radars to avoid harm attacks, became a significant factor. With this, we saw the temporary reintroduction of the TB2 as a strike weapon on the Kherson front. The fact that that was possible suggests that Russian air defenses in the area had either been suppressed by being required to turn off their radars or destroyed by the missiles. Either way, examples like this prove that the air defense systems on both sides were not exactly invulnerable. Given recent events, I thought it was also worth calling out the fact that missile attacks have been one of the greatest challenges for both sides, albeit in very different ways. For Ukraine, it's been the challenge of Russian cruise missile attacks against Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. The problems here are many. How do you find enough air defense systems to protect every city, every power plant, every piece of critical infrastructure? And then not only to protect it at all, but to protect it against a potential saturation attack. If your enemy can fire 12, 14, 20, 30 cruise missiles at a particular target, then you need enough air defenses to protect any given target from 12, 20, 30 cruise missiles. That's just not practical. Not when you're facing an enemy that seems willing to designate a pedestrian footbridge in Kyiv as a priority military target. And so Ukraine has been able to shoot down some incoming Russian cruise missiles. We have visual evidence of them doing so. But we also know that some missiles get through. They hit critical targets, they cause blackouts, damage, and casualties. The Ukrainian air defenses are good, but they're clearly not good enough to stop everything getting through. On the Russian side, the challenge has been Ukrainian rocket attacks using guided munitions fired from M270 and Himars. And we'll examine the inability of Russian air defenses to protect targets like the Antonovsky Bridge, which was one of the key logistical links going into Kherson. Now, in some ways, these are very different threats from each other. A cruise missile and a rocket launched from Himars are very different beasts. But in both cases, the air defense systems are suffering with a target that differs from the typical traditional targets, aircraft and helicopters. So I thought it might be worth examining how the air defense systems are performed against those different target types in detail. And in Ukraine, I would generally rate the performance of both sides' air defenses against fixed-wing and rotary aviation as pretty effective. Yes, there are examples of launch failures, guidance failures, technical malfunctions, and even the occasional return to sender error. It happens. But overall, I think there are two pieces of evidence to suggest that generally speaking, the SAMS and the air defense system has done its job. The first is how both air forces are flying. The fact that ground attack aircraft on both sides are choosing to come in at incredibly low level, that helicopters are choosing to do the same and then employ these pitch-up attacks, an attack method that I talked about in my video on helicopters, suggests that the pilots would rather get down on the deck and risk crashing, technical malfunction, or engagement by man-pads and short-range air defenses, despite the fact that those systems are everywhere in Ukraine right now. Despite the fact that every babushka out there probably has a Stinger in the basement, pilots are choosing to fly low. And that to me suggests that they regard flying higher, where the other air defense systems like Buk or S-300 can engage them, isn't just dangerous, but outright suicidal. They'd rather take a risk on the man-pads and the SHORAD than the near-certain destruction that flying at higher altitude would bring. The second point of evidence is just the sheer casualties involved on both sides, even if you limit yourself to just visually confirmed losses. Obviously, both sides claim far higher casualties for their opponent than we're able to visually confirm. But even limiting ourselves to just that visually confirmed component, we can see some pretty significant casualties for both sides' air forces. Russia is visually confirmed to have lost something like 60 fixed-wing aircraft and 52 rotary-winged aircraft, i.e. helicopters. Ukraine, meanwhile, 51 fixed-wing aircraft, and 15 helicopters. For Russia, that is a significant loss of its frontline aircraft strength. For Ukraine, those losses are outright dire. And those very high casualty rates are characteristic of a high operational tempo, demanding mission types, that is, launching attack missions at very low altitudes, all coupled with a high threat environment. The tempo of operation really leaves no room for error for mechanics and maintainers. This style of flying demanded at low level gives zero margin of error for pilots. And at any given time, there is a risk that a man-pad or a SHORAD system or another air defense system is able to get a lock, acquire you as a target, and bring you crashing down. While it will likely be many years before we have accurate, complete loss numbers, as well as the cause for which each aircraft was lost, for now the best available evidence suggests a skew towards the effectiveness of air defences, and the conclusion that missile systems, be they man-pads or the heavier S-300s, TORs and Books, are extracting a pretty heavy toll. All of which suggests that the Russians and also the Ukrainians have failed fundamentally at SEAD operations, suppression of enemy air defences or destruction of enemy air defences. For forces like the United States Air Force, the opening stage of a campaign should be the destruction of enemy air defences using both cruise munitions and also aircraft. Because you see, America and many Western countries really like air power. And they like it so much that even if you call aircraft the scissors in a rock, paper, scissors matchup, they're convinced you can build a sufficiently sharp pair of scissors that it even beats rock. Western air forces use aircraft with specially designed munitions, like the HARM missile. They employ specially trained crews, and they go out and they hunt enemy air defences, suppressing them or destroying them. Now, on paper, Russia is meant to possess many of these capabilities as well. They have, for example, their own anti-radiation missiles. But the way they're flying and the casualties they have suffered suggest that there's been no theatre-wide success in suppressing or destroying Ukrainian air defences. Meanwhile, Ukraine also has to continue to fly in a very defensive manner. They've achieved some local successes using the integration of HARM with their own Soviet-style aircraft, but for the most part, you still see them flying low and quick to avoid interception. Overall, therefore, I think it's fair to say that the air defences have largely accomplished their objectives when it comes to aircraft and helicopters. They've kept them flying low, they've inflicted attrition, and they've made certain mission types impossible. But before you go spending half the national defence budget on Soviet-era air defence missile systems, remember that not every target is a non-stealthy aircraft or helicopter. There are a lot of unconventional and harder-to-hit targets out there. Ukraine is not the first war to feature unconventional 21st century style targets, but it's certainly included a lot of them. We've seen a proliferation of drones of all size groups, ranging from things like the TB2 all the way down to little DJI micro drones purchased off the shelf. Cruise and ballistic missiles like Kalibr and Iskander have featured very heavily in Russian tactics. Artillery rocket systems like Himars and M270 have featured heavily for the Ukrainians. And then on both sides you have loitering munitions and kamikaze UAVs, things like Shahed from Iran on the Russian side, things like Switchblade and Phoenix Ghost for the Ukrainians. And watching how air defences have dealt with these target types has been particularly educational. The TB2, for example, was a star of the early war. The Bayraktar was so famous and successful, it got a song made out of it as people put together a montage of it destroying air defence systems that it had no right to destroy. Those early successes of the Bayraktar have been a huge shot in the arm for the drone industry in Turkey, which has made numerous sales off the back of battlefield performance in Ukraine. But both loss statistics and Ukrainian commentary confirm that after the early stages of the war, the quality of Russian air defences basically made using the TB2 in a strike role essentially impossible in most areas of the front. The thing was just too vulnerable. It could still be used, of course. It was used in a surveillance and a distraction role and a reconnaissance role. It was involved in the Moskva sinking, for example. But unless paired with suppression of enemy air defences activity, like with the use of HIMARS missiles in the Kherson front, the TB2 wasn't able to operate with impunity in the same strike role that it enjoyed in those first few days on the Kyiv front. It was too slow and not quite stealthy enough to avoid destruction in a particularly high-threat environment. Although given the price difference between a TB2 and something like a TOR or a Book, those early war victories certainly paid for the TB2 fleet many times over. Much more problematic than something like a TB2 have been hard to intercept targets, like the GMLRS rockets fired from systems like Himars. As a target, there's a range of things that make these rockets harder to hit than aircraft. For one thing, they're much smaller. You don't have to squeeze a pilot or all the bits intended to keep the squishy human being alive into the airframe. All you need is a rocket motor, which is a pretty good way of making things go quickly for a relatively short period of time, a guidance package, and a warhead, as well as things like control surfaces. A small target moving extremely quickly that only appears on radar for a relatively short period between launch and arrival is inevitably going to be a harder target. And this is not just supposition. We have visual evidence of this being a problem, particularly the Antonovsky Bridge. Now, as an observer, the Antonovsky Bridge sort of campaign, the campaign to destroy it by the Ukrainians, is very useful for an observer, because what you have is a high-value strategic target that is visibly defended by Russian air defences, but it is also surrounded by pro-Ukrainian civilians who are very fond of filming and taking photos every time there was an attack on the bridge. And the Russians themselves seem fond of releasing footage of the aftermath showing the damage of those strikes. In order to help choke off logistical supply to Russian forces in Kherson, the Ukrainian forces have repeatedly shelled the Antonovsky Bridge using Himars rockets. And what we have are a number of videos from people observing those strikes. I've included some stills on this slide where you can see Russian air defences firing salvos of missiles, ostensibly at incoming targets, and then you can see a pattern of impact hits on the bridge itself. Now, if you see air defences firing, and then you see 6 missile hits on the bridge, there's room to make some conclusions. Now, it could be possible the Ukrainians are firing very, very, very large volleys of missiles, and most of them are being intercepted. But it seems odd that 6 is the number of rockets that would fit in a Himars system, and 6 are the impacts that you see. This would seem to suggest that even around a target the Russians know they have to protect, and that we can see them stationing air defences around, things like the GMLRS rockets are still able to penetrate those defences and score hits, seemingly fairly reliably. Now, there are a wide range of theories out there as to why Russian air defences have struggled with Himars rockets. I'll link a number of those theories in the description. I suspect it's probably a combination of all of them, including the fact that it's hard to hit something that's 4 meters long, 22 centimeters wide, and it's traveling 2.5 times the speed of sound. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised given how much effort American coalition and Israeli forces have had to put in to investing in defense systems capable of dealing with, say, incoming rockets, mortars, or artillery rounds. But the likely finding remains the likely finding. Air defences in Ukraine have struggled with targets like Himars rockets, a fact which has caused particular frustration to the Russians, unlike the next category of targets, which is particularly annoying to the Ukrainians. Because the other category of problematic target is not those things that are really hard to shoot down, like Himars rockets. It's systems that are so cheap that it's inefficient to shoot them down, but which you have to shoot down anyway. Russia, for example, makes very wide use of the Orlan 10 drone. This thing has a nominal sticker price of $100,000 although if you look at the components that go into it, it should probably be worth about 1/5 of that. Now, an Orlan is not particularly hard to shoot down. It's a relatively primitive system. It's got a very low performance engine, it's not armoured, it's there for all to see and potentially hit, but it is small and it is cheap, and that provides a problem. If you use, say, for example, a book or a Tor to shoot one down, you are using a very expensive missile to kill a very cheap drone. Given Ukraine's supply issues and the fact that NATO countries don't exactly have an infinite supply of Soviet SAMs to hand over, that presents an issue. But if you don't destroy the drone, then you leave yourself open to it feeding targeting information to artillery systems, to air systems, to cruise missiles, and leading to your expensive systems being targeted by the enemy. So destroying the Orlan is not optional. If the only system the Ukrainians have in an area to destroy one is a book, they will fire a book, and we have videos of them doing so. They prefer to use manpads or cheaper systems if they're on hand, but if nothing else will do, there's very little choice other than to fire the expensive system, because to do otherwise would put that system at risk. And the problem is likely to get worse as more Iranian loitering munitions and drones begin to arrive in theatre, the Shaheds. When you're talking about Shahed, you're talking about a system that doesn't cost 100 grand, it costs maybe 20 grand. And there are precious few systems out there that can cost effectively engage a $20,000 loitering munition. And if you don't destroy the incoming loitering munition, well, it's going to go find a target somewhere and apply its warhead to it. Now, this is not a novel problem in Ukraine. The Saudis have been dealing with this problem for years. So too, ironically, have the Israelis. In both cases, the powers involved are dealing with an opponent that uses things like loitering munitions and cheap drones in order to attack their infrastructure, which they have to respond with using either Iron Dome interceptor rockets in one case, or in the Saudi case, Patriot missiles and sometimes even AMRAAMs fired from F-15s. Now, Saudi Arabia is a rich country, but one questions how sustainable it is firing Patriot rockets at $20,000 drones. For Ukraine, with Iranian loitering munitions arriving in ever greater numbers, the problem is likely to become more and more acute. And so I think it's fair to say that air defences in Ukraine have performed very, very well against their traditional opponents, aircraft and helicopters, but there are definitely target types out there that have caused them to struggle more than a little. The essential problem the engineers face here, of course, is how do you get an advanced guidance system that can get a rocket to hit another small object that might be moving at the time, and yet also do it more cheaply than, taking what is basically an Alibaba drone and sticking a 40-kilo warhead on it. And so now we've talked about some general features of the engagement, let's ground it in everyone's favourite, some statistics. Because in terms of predicting where the war is going to go next, particularly in the air defence space, the attrition on both sides' air defence forces becomes a significant factor. After all, it's hard to predict if anything will change if you don't know how many units or pieces of equipment both sides are losing. And here, all of the usual caveats and extras apply. There are a lot of reasons that you won't see visual confirmation of destruction of air defence systems. For example, air defence systems are usually positioned fairly far behind the lines, which means they're unlikely to be photographed by opposing infantry or troops unless a very, very large-scale advance has taken place. Instead, a lot of the strike types that are going to hit these systems aren't going to leave much in the way of visual evidence. For example, a HARM missile attack is not going to give you nice pictures of the S-300 radar that you blew up. Artillery and missile attack, likewise. Unless there is a drone correcting the fire, you are not going to have visual evidence of the strike. So please, while I use visually confirmed loss data for a reason, namely that there's more reason to consider it reliable as a base floor level of losses than relying on official statements from either side, don't consider them definitive. In terms of losses to Russian aircraft and air defense capabilities, we have visual evidence of 76 Russian SAM systems, 20 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, and 15 pieces of AAA artillery being destroyed or captured. Of these, 22 of those SAM systems were captured, and 7 of the anti-aircraft guns, the self-propelled mounts, were also captured. Now, the heaviest losses have been amongst the shorter range systems for the Russians. That is, there have been relatively few S-300 tells that we have seen captured, destroyed, or abandoned. We've seen lots instead of the Buks and Tors and Pantsirs. In terms of aircraft, I mentioned the loss numbers earlier. 62 aircraft and 53 helicopters lost over the course of the war since February. Now, as with other categories like tanks or AFEs, Ukrainian losses on paper have been lower than Russian ones. But when you're talking about aircraft and SAM systems, the gap between Ukrainian and Russian losses is a lot narrower than it is with some other systems. The Ukrainians have, for example, lost 47 SAM systems, visually confirmed. And also notable is the fact that, unlike the Russians, where losses were tilted towards the short-range systems, visual evidence from the Ukrainian side is that losses are tilted towards the longer-range systems, the S-300s. They had about 250 launch systems available before the war, according to MB 2021, which means about 10% of the S-300 inventory is visually confirmed destroyed. The loss of 52 fixed-wing aircraft, meanwhile, is a very significant portion of pre-war Ukrainian aircraft strength, significant even when you account for a supply of aircraft in parts kit form or in disassembled form by other countries. Russian losses are higher, yes, but they represent a higher percentage of Ukraine's overall pre-war force. And unlike with tanks or SAM systems, there's no captured Russian materiel to help make up the numbers. And there's also reason to think that Ukraine, and to an extent also Russia, is struggling to sustain its air defense capabilities in the country. On the Russian side, for example, you've got air defense systems being pulled out of Syria and also away from countries like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Not exactly something you think that would be their first choice. For Ukraine, meanwhile, the major concern is simple ammunition consumption. How many anti-aircraft missiles does it have? Because it's firing them off fairly regularly, intercepting everything from Russian aircraft and helicopters to cruise missiles and incoming drones. Every time an incoming Russian Caliber, for example, is intercepted by a Ukrainian S-300, that's a Ukrainian target that isn't being struck. But in many ways, you can think of it as the caliber being traded for another S-300 missile, and there's only so many of those to go around. In fact, at this point, I'm surprised the Russian MOD hasn't started reporting failed missile strikes as the successful destruction of Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles. It is extremely impressive that the airspace over Ukraine remains so heavily contested after 7 months of attritional fighting. But unlike in other systems categories, the numbers in front of us suggest that in the air and air defense category, the numbers are generally trending in Russia's direction so far as attrition goes. Now, our loss statistics are unreliable, and the Russians probably aren't exactly doing us any favours by taking photos and reporting their own behind-the-line losses. But just on the figures in front of us, the conclusion I come to is pretty stark. Ukraine is going to run out of aircraft and surface-to-air missiles before Russia does. And as such, if Ukraine wants to continue contesting its own airspace, if it wants to defend its cities, its power plants and its critical infrastructure, the need for Western systems is only going to grow over time. And given that, perhaps it's time we talk about some Western air defense systems and the ones that have been pledged to Ukraine in particular. Now, historically, Western forces haven't placed as much emphasis on air defense as the Soviets and the Russians have. Most Western air defense systems tend to have shorter ranges than the longer-ranged Russian equivalents, and there's also a greater preponderance of systems that are optimized against targets like ballistic missiles as opposed to against aircraft. After all, the Air Force will kill the aircraft. America, for example, has some very capable missile defense systems like THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System. But it doesn't really have a direct equivalent to some of the S-400 missiles that are designed to engage things like tankers and AWACS aircraft out to 400 kilometers. That said, the difference isn't absolute. If you talk about the practical engagement range of something like a PAC-2 Patriot missile, which is an American anti-aircraft missile, against something like S-300, the difference in practical engagement range, that is how far away you'd actually fire a missile against a maneuvering fighter, for example, isn't that different. But in general, grossly simplified terms, Western air defences tend to be relatively short-ranged compared to their Russian competitors. And there tends to be a lot fewer of them in inventory for any given class or classification. Because again, the US Army and the US Marine Corps go around generally assuming that the US Air Force and the US Navy will be kind enough to provide air superiority for them, rather than requiring they use a quarter of their vehicles to truck around anti-aircraft missile systems. They still possess SHORAD capabilities, but there is a greater reliance on Allied air cover. And considering the budget allocation to the US Air Force, I think that's fair enough. A number of these Western systems have been pledged to go to Ukraine or have already been delivered. And indeed, in the aftermath of the recent Russian missile and rocket attacks that followed the bombing of the Crimean Bridge, we've seen an acceleration of these resupply efforts by Western countries. And I note here I'm only including Western anti-aircraft systems, not Soviet or Warsaw Pact era air defense systems that have been supplied by NATO countries, and there have been several. But in terms of Western systems, some of the major ones that stand out are the pledge, for example, of 8 batteries of the NASAMS system. That's actually a Norwegian system. NASAMS stands for Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System. I believe it was developed by Kongsberg, but the US is bankrolling the purchase. We'll talk about that system a little more in a moment. There's also a pledge of 4 systems of the IRIS-T system from Germany. There's 30 Gepard, Flakpanzer Gepard, self-propelled anti-aircraft guns pledged by Germany that are many of which are already in Ukraine. The Stormer HVM from the UK. This is basically an armoured mount for a bunch of Starstreak missiles of Manpad's fame. We have some weird and wonderful systems out there. Finland, for example, there are some Finnish anti-aircraft guns that have appeared in Ukraine. Who knows how those got there? You really should leave padlocks on your arms warehouses, Finland. I don't know why Finnish weapon systems keep surfacing in Ukraine, despite you not announcing the fact that they're going there. And then recently you've got this announcement from Spain that they're sending some of their MIM-23 Hawks. And I saw some pro-Russian commentators laugh at this one, saying that, hey, this is a 1960s air defense system. Is NATO really that desperate? I mean, firstly, these are upgraded missile systems. And I wouldn't encourage any Air Force pilot to laugh at an S-300 just because the original missile system was designed in the 60s. And the second point is because NATO's superpower is interoperability, the radar system that supports MIM-23 is interchangeable with radar systems that are already in use for other Western systems in Ukraine. So what you're left with is a mid-capability anti-aircraft missile system that can be used with existing infrastructure. Makes sense to me. But this is a pretty eclectic list. How does it all click together in order to try and give Ukraine an enduring anti-aircraft capability? Because eventually the S-300s are going to run out. And at a basic level, there aren't that many NATO or near-NATO countries with large inventories of Soviet-era air defense systems that they'd be willing to hand over to Ukraine. There are some NATO countries with inventories. Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria, for example, all stand out. But for various reasons, none of them are likely to provide their existing inventories of S-300 or, in Turkey's case, S-400. All three have been pretty circumspect about weapons deliveries to Ukraine. And in the case of Greece and Turkey, both rely on their Soviet air defense systems in order to defend against, well, each other. And even if we extend the inventory question to Western-style air defense systems, Western inventories of air defense systems are pretty stretched. In very simple terms, most Western nations simply don't have large inventories of SAM systems that are available and ready to hand over at short notice. And that goes part of the way towards explaining why, when systems like NASAMS and IRIS-T are being pledged, often it's new build production that has a significant time delay before it can be made available. The existing inventories just aren't there. But those same supply issues are one of the reasons why NASAMS is probably one of the best available answers for Ukraine, and why they're probably likely to hunt for way more than the 8 batteries that have already been pledged. You see, NASAMS is capable of firing a wide array of missiles, most of which are ordinary air-to-air missiles used by NATO aircraft. The default option is essentially AIM-120 AMRAAM. This is a long-range radar-guided missile that is usually fired from fighter aircraft, which means it doesn't just draw on a limited stock of specialized surface-to-air missiles, it can draw on the wider stock of air-to-air missiles in the inventory of many NATO countries. The United States Air Force, for example, has an awful lot of AMRAAMs lying around, and there wasn't exactly much cause to fire them in Iraq or Afghanistan. The Taliban wasn't exactly big on high-performance fighter aircraft. And so, if NASAMS is supplied and brought online, there's probably a pretty deep stock of missiles that can be fired from them, and those missiles can come from a variety of allied countries. And if AIM-120s aren't available in large enough numbers, or if you're engaging relatively smaller, cheaper targets, you can fire AIM-9 as well, the Sidewinder. Now, those missiles are still expensive, but they're available in very large numbers, and they do the job, and they are cheaper than a lot of the AMRAAM variants. So again, this is a case of interoperability to the rescue. Britain, for example, is pledging that it will supply hundreds of air defense missiles to Ukraine. It probably means missile systems that are compatible with NASAMS, at least in some cases. At least for the moment, it seems like NATO can't use its strongest area of military capability, its air forces, in order to support Ukraine, because there's been no decision made and there's no infrastructure in place to transfer NATO standard jets. But with the provision of NASAMS at least, Air Force stocks can be used to sustain Ukrainian air defences. It's hardly an exact match for the S-300 system that it's going to replace, but at least the missiles are there to sustain it. And so if Ukraine is to avoid being attritioned out by Russia and losing its ability to contest its airspace, it probably doesn't just need new jets and new helicopters, it needs air defense systems like NASAMS in numbers and the missiles to fire from them. So to zoom out now and try and encapsulate some of the themes and observations that we've seen in the war so far. The first is that integration and logistics are obviously key. When Russian logistics and organisation broke down in the early stages of the war, their air defense systems became vulnerable. Once they got things sorted out again, those air defense systems became formidable and the TB2 could no longer operate. Both sides have faced challenges when the front is moving quickly and the air defense systems struggle to stay organised and to keep up. That's something that needs to be practiced and trained. There have also been some friendly fire incidents, which again highlights the importance of a network system and situational awareness for air defense commanders. In any military force, any loss hurts, but nothing hurts quite like blue on blue. The second thing I'd call out is backed up both by observed reality on the ground and also a number of Russian commentators. Suppression of enemy air defences and destruction of enemy air defences are hard. Observing the performance of Western air forces over Libya or Iraq, some observers have taken the seed stage of conflict for granted. It shouldn't be. Western seed capabilities are extremely expensive and hard fought for. Seed pilots are often specialised, their units are specialised, they train the mission constantly, and that training is expensive. And those training hours are augmented by efforts in developing doctrine and tactics, and also in specialized technology, not just the anti-radiation missiles themselves, but also all of the sensors that go into making sure these aircraft are as safe as they can possibly be. As far as air forces go, Russia was about as near peer as it got. On paper, they were meant to have SEAD capabilities. They had the specialized weapons, for example, but they didn't have specialized squadrons. They didn't have a doctrine for doing it at scale. They didn't have pilots that were trained specifically in the mission. And as a result, the Ukrainian air defense system is still intact after 7 months of war. And I suspect any military that expects it may be called on to break an integrated air defense system of any given level of capability in the future will be paying particular attention to that lesson. It's not enough to just have some attack aircraft and some anti-radiation missiles and claim you have SEAD capability. You probably need specialized pilots who train on the mission and the airframe and technology to support it. Scissors does not naturally beat rock, so if you want to cut through rock with your scissors, you better get sharpening. So far as drones go, it's clear that not all drones can operate in high-risk environments. But in this case, both of the opponents and proponents are probably right and wrong. Systems like TB2 are having a hard time operating in high-threat environments, at least in a strike role, and in that narrow sense, the critics are definitely right. But at the same time, it's been shown that it's hard to maintain a high-threat environment on the march, during a rapid advance, or during periods of disorganization. And so forces that are equipped with drones like the TB2 or the Reaper probably need to be capable of recognizing these opportunities if they present itself and quickly pivoting to exploit them while bringing their systems back and not exposing them once enemy air defenses get their act together. But frankly, I think it's the performance of the small drones, the loitering munitions, the micro drones that should probably scare all of us. These things are small, they're cheap, they're accessible, they're low knowledge, they're limited barriers to entry, they have reasonable range, and it's difficult to intercept them in a cost-effective fashion. But a failure to intercept them can cause significant damage to valuable targets. This is a problem. Now again, I don't think we should over-exaggerate the problem. Militaries shouldn't pour 50% of the defense budget into buying as many Shahed 136s as Iran is willing to sell them. These systems obviously have limitations. They can't be that high performance if they're going to be cheap. If they're going to be small, there's a limit to the warhead that they can carry. The Shahed only carries about a 40-kilo warhead, which is of limited utility against a lot of target types compared to the several hundred kilos you can put on a cruise missile. And there are limits on the sensor package that you can again fit into a cheap, affordable, disposable suicide drone. So it needs to be supported by other ISR assets to make sure it actually hits something valuable. But the threat is definitely there. The drones are in position and they're being used. Countries probably need a plan for the Switchblades or Shaheds of the future that is better than taking a high-performance fighter aircraft and firing million-dollar air-to-air missiles at them. The extension on this observation is one that we've been kind of observing for some time now, looking at Israel or Saudi Arabia and their experiences. The small and the cheap is as threatening as the big and the expensive sometimes. If existing air defenses tend to have a problem, it's that they can have difficulty intercepting small, cheap, or hard-to-hit targets, especially when they combine all of those factors together, and doing it in a cost-effective and reliable way. The Himars guided rockets have been hard to shoot down. Systems like Shahed and Orlan are expensive to shoot down cost-efficiently. And if you don't find an alternative, you become Saudi Arabia, firing Patriot interceptors at what are basically off-the-shelf drones. So bringing this all together, what might it mean, both for Ukraine going forward and also for the wider market for air defense systems? Because at the end of the day, it wouldn't be one of my videos if I didn't opine on what this might mean for industry. The first point is I think most countries, if they haven't already, will recognize the requirement for air defense capabilities that are configured against targets that have poor or limited performance characteristics but which are small or cheap. You need to be able to shoot down or jam cheap-ass drones, loitering munitions, and even basic artillery rounds in some cases. And we are seeing a variety of solutions either trialled in Ukraine or developed elsewhere. In Ukraine, you will have seen drone jammers in use by both sides, handheld or non-handheld vehicle-borne jamming systems that are designed to disrupt drones and force them to land. These sort of soft kill systems are at their best when they're targeting drones that are bought off the shelf because they're not hardened or protected against these sort of attacks. So all those little swarms of DJI drones that were being bought from Chinese suppliers for use by both sides they're the ones that are most vulnerable to these sort of jamming systems, at least as a general rule. Then you've got the search for actually kinetic kill solutions, things that actually destroy the incoming munition or the drone. And there are a variety of systems out there that'll do the job. Gun-based solutions, laser-based solutions that are in development, and even recently in one case in Ukraine, I think the first example captured on video of a drone being used to attempt to ram another drone during combat conditions and as a result being destroyed. All of these solutions are probably going to get a renewed look with some renewed vigour after countries observe the experiences in Ukraine. Some of the solutions may in fact be pretty old ones. We'll have to wait for more data to come out of Ukraine, but for example, the old Flakpanzer Gepard system is being vouched for as one potential solution to Russian drones. The Gepard is a very old system. The absence of missiles means engaging a high-performance fighter jet at high altitude, for example, is out of the question. But drones aren't high performance, not the ones we're talking about in Ukraine. They're low, they're slow, and with them, engaging them with a very accurate cannon system is probably good enough. Compared to a missile system, gun rounds are pretty cheap, and so what we've seen in at least one case so far is Ukraine pairing a Gepard vehicle with a surface-to-air missile launcher system, so that the unit operating those two systems has a choice of engagement method, a missile if it needs it, a gun if it doesn't. Alongside the Gepards, we've seen reports of the use of old-school flat guns, modern jamming systems, and manpads all used to counter the drone and loitering munition threat. In terms of cost per engagement, there are also a range of new systems that are coming online in the future, or at least are in development, that may be promising as well. We'll talk about those in a moment. I think there's also reason to suspect that people will be looking at the successes and failures of Russian electronic warfare in some detail. Observers will want to have an understanding of why Russian electronic warfare may have worked early on to a much greater extent than it's working now. There'll also, I think, be a desire to see whether or not the failure of Russian systems to engage targets like Himars rockets represents a software rather than a technical failing. And if it does, how rugged are the processes to enable militaries to roll out rapid software updates in an emergency? If an enemy comes up with a new target type and you need to reprogram your systems to properly identify, categorize, and assist the operator in engaging it, how quickly can you develop and roll out those upgrades? The bloke at the front is probably not going to be thrilled if you tell him it's an 18-month development cycle. He's after a day one patch, not 3 years in early access. And then there's the reaction of the wider market itself. And there's a couple of points that I can make here. The first is that while certain Russian vehicles and technologies have thrown themselves open for wide criticism, in general, Soviet and Russian air defense systems in Ukraine generally seem to have done their jobs pretty well against a variety of targets. The Ukrainians obviously use older versions of the system and have been able to use them to keep the Russian Air Force largely at bay. They've also used them to engage some pretty nasty target types, including the most advanced cruise missiles used by the Russians. Now, those comments don't flow equally across all systems. Pantsir has had some bad moments, bogging down, being abandoned, combined with relatively little visual evidence so far of it being used successfully. Not to say that it hasn't, just that the evidence base isn't there yet. But overall, Buktor S300, they all seem to have done their jobs relatively well. What the market will be looking for, however, is a solution to the problem of harder targets, cheap drones, loitering munitions, things like that. And here there are a number of promising entries on the market that may seek to capitalize on the new requirements. There are a number of laser-based systems out there that are either in development or testing, and lasers can usually engage a target for considerably cheaper than, for example, a missile system can. If you want something a little more old school, then there are systems like the Rheinmetall Skynex system out there. This is basically a smart cannon system with properly fused ammunition that is being tested to try and counter things like drone swarm attacks. Now obviously an advanced cannon round is going to cost more than a basic slug, but it's still going to be cheaper than firing AMRAAMs at the thing, and no, I'm not going to let that go. So expect to see buyers and industry looking very closely at everything from lasers to smart cannons to jammers and EWAR in order to try and counter the proliferation of cheap drones. But as always, I'll cap this off by reminding people not to overlearn the lessons. Just because air defences in Ukraine have been able to effectively counter manned jets and helicopters relatively effectively doesn't mean those sort of high-performance threats aren't going to be out there in the future, and that all that one needs to worry about are things like loitering munitions and cruise missiles. Ukraine doesn't, for example, provide any evidence of how air defences of this era will respond to the presence of, say, for example, stealthy 5th-generation aircraft with limited radar visibility and standoff or smart munitions. Su-57 is not F-35, and even if it was, there's only 5 of the bloody things. And if the air defence pendulum drifts too far away from high-performance threats to cheap ones, well, it may be that just causes an opening for high-performance threats in the future. So while there's probably a lesson to learn here, let's just be careful not to overlearn it. So in conclusion, air defence systems have generally performed fairly well in Ukraine, which helps explain the absence of air dominance by either side, despite the fact the Russian Air Force was very large. That said, when you account for force size, generally so far, attrition of the air forces and air defence systems that we can visually confirm has actually generally favoured the Russians. The Russians have lost more systems and more aircraft, but they've got a lot more to lose. As a result, a number of Western systems are being introduced, and there are questions over the sustainability of the existing Soviet systems that are in use in Ukraine. Ukraine has achieved miracles in keeping its airspace contested as long as it has, but unless it receives vital resupply of Western air defence systems, eventually that advantage, that effort, is going to be lost. We can also observe that there's a range of new target types, things like loitering munitions, that are being in use in Ukraine that have taxed existing systems to their limit, and that as a result, the market is probably likely to see an accelerated focus on systems designed to counter those small, cheap, affordable targets, like loitering munitions and small drones. But as always, the data is still patchy and the conclusions are uncertain, so please do not take this as financial advice or as advice on where to put your national defence budget. Alright, channel update to close out. Firstly, I'm looking forward to actually producing something at home in the near future. The overall performance of the channel over the last few weeks has frankly been incredible. The rate of growth in subscribers and whatnot has just been huge, and I continue to be frankly humbled by it. I will do these as long as I feel I have something valuable to say that I can say with some confidence. But I will say the immense growth in subscribers and views and Patreon supporters and all of that does make me feel a lot better about the hours that go into preparing these. I will also add a brief comment about the recent incident where my channel and a bunch of others got demonetized by YouTube. I know it gave us all a little bit of a scare, not least of which because I believe YouTube is much less aggressive in pushing videos if they're not monetized. But we've been assured it was just a technical glitch and that everything should be back online now. To that end, I just want to say this. A number of people did join the Patreon when I announced that I had been demonetized. Now, I am humbled by that gesture and I genuinely appreciate it. But if you joined up because I had been demonetized and you wanted to keep me on air, please let me know. I've been remonetized, and if you want a refund on your pledge, I can put that through for you. There are people on YouTube who either need every cent or certainly grasp for every cent. I will not be one of them. So if anyone wants their money back, just send me a message on Patreon and I'll get that processed for you. To close out, a brief thank you to my subtitler, my sound guy, the various sources who I talk to in Ukraine and elsewhere. Your efforts are always very much appreciated. And a brief cross-promotion to my gaming channel and my current playthrough of Terra Invicta. Frankly, I have very little spare time, and that which I do have, I do choose to spend playing that game and recording it for everyone's enjoyment. So if you're at all interested, the channel is linked below. Thank you once again to everyone for your engagement and support, and I will see you all again next week.